just before we get into it, can you kind of describe the three types of karma? The prarabdha karma, sanchita karma, and sanchiyama karma, yamana karma.
So, and now I hope I don't get them mixed up. But the but the prarabdha karma is what is already in motion, and in a sense has to be experienced, right? So it is karma that we bring into this life, and we can't really undo it. It has to come to fruition. It's still in the process of coming to fruition. And then you have the karmas. Now, again, I mix the two up sometimes, but there are karmas that are experienced more or less instantaneously, right? They're the ones that, John Lennon's famous instant karma, right? That come to fruition in this life and that are.
I think that's sanchita karma.
I think that's sanchita karma that are very clearly cause and effect relations. And in fact, someone who does not even believe in karma in the broader sense would accept this particular sense of karma. It's just sort of like this immediate causation.
Right.
And then you have, and now again I'm getting hazy on
yamana karma.
Yamana karma. I believe this is connected more with ritual, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I think I might be.
No, because I think this karma is actually the karma that is done in this life, but goes into your next life.
Oh yeah, it becomes the prarabdha karma of the next life. That's right. It's the mirror of prarabdha karma, you can say, in that sense. Yeah. So you have the karma that you do, because of course the original meaning of karma is work or action.
Right.
So you do the action, it has its effect. You have karma whose effect is immediate. You have karma whose effects you're still experiencing. The action was not committed in this life, it's inherited. And you have the actions that will yet be experienced in the more distant future. And it's those first and third that really bring the topic of reincarnation to the fore, right? Because the middle one is something, like I said, someone who doesn't even really believe in this whole system can accept that actions have effects, and we experience those effects very often. And I've actually even talked to skeptics who are willing to say, well, our actions have future effects, but we don't experience those. They're experienced, historically later on, and so on. But the concept of karma is accepted, and again, with variations across the Indic traditions, is that we ourselves will, in some sense, experience the effects of all these actions. And so, since one lifetime is clearly not sufficient for accounting for the effects of all these actions, since we clearly do things and don't live to experience their necessary results, that has to happen at some later point. And the same is true at the other end with prarabdha karma. It explains the inequalities, the unevenness we see in the world, that we're not all born as blank slates, and we're not all born with the same conditions. So those conditions have to have been set in motion previously by us, according to the Indian model. Max Weber called it the rationally perfect theodicy. It's not clear if he believed in it, but he found it quite persuasive, at least on a logical level, that it places the entire responsibility for our actions and their effects on ourselves.
Right.
Critics can say, well, then you're blaming the victim in terms of you see someone suffering, well, it's because of the karma. But Swami Vivekananda flipped that and said that if we caused it, that means we can uncause it. We can undo it. We can take different, the power is in our hands to make different decisions now in the present and change our future. So that it can be seen as an empowering doctrine or as a fatalist doctrine. And of course, we see both of those in the Indian traditions.
Right. So it's actually, have you heard of, I think, Professor A.L. Herman? He wrote a book actually called The Problem of Evil, where he goes through the theodicies of Christianity, Islam, and then various types of Hindu Vedanta and stuff like that. So it's a amazing book, and I think finally he comes to he says the tightest one is like Ramanuja's and someone else's. But that's from his perspective. But it's a fascinating edition.
I tend to be pretty close to his perspective on that.
So can we get into your the chapter. So you want to start with your chapter that you not your introduction, but kind of like your
my chapter. My chapter is a defense of the rationality of believing in reincarnation, and I make a distinction, which I hope comes through in the article, between sort of asserting that reincarnation is the case and saying that to believe in reincarnation is not an irrational response to the data of being human and the kinds of experiences we have, because it tends to be written off in the Western world as just a crazy idea. And this is one reason I think a lot of people don't write about it, even though they're fascinated by it. But they're unwilling to be labeled kooks if they come out and say, well, I actually take this idea seriously. And however, I think it stands up really well, in the sort of Purva-Paksha sense, if you contrast it with its alternatives. And so in the article, what I do is I give a little bit of my autobiographical background, sort of what I mentioned earlier in our podcast. And then I talk about, first of all, just the justification for not taking a materialist perspective of it. In other words, what about the widespread view that you just die and that's it, and life is hard, too bad, that's just how the universe is, and saying that, no, there are actually rational grounds for the kind of cosmic hope, to use John Hick's term, that you see in the world's religions. That and I talk about William James and his idea of the rationality of belief, and that so long as something does not clash with our best scientific understanding, and so long as believing in it improves your life, makes you a better person, then purely on those pragmatic grounds, he said, you have the right to believe whatever you want. And some would say, well, reincarnation contradicts science because, well, there's no evidence for it. But it's different. There's a difference between saying that there's insufficient evidence for something and saying that it cannot be the case. Right? I think it's tendentious to say that there cannot be reincarnation. That involves a whole prior set of philosophical claims, not just scientific observation. So that's my argument, that we are rationally justified in believing in something. And then I say, well, why reincarnation? So one alternative, of course, already discussed, is the materialist one. The other is the one we tend to find in the Abrahamic religions, where you have a heaven or a hell. And then I go through the argument I had in my own mind in my childhood with the traditional Catholic point of view on that. And I actually engaged directly with Bradley Malkowski's article there, because in his article, he explains why the Roman Catholic Church traditionally rejects the idea of reincarnation. Right. And I want to take that very seriously. So I give an argument for, well, first I say, well, what do I mean by reincarnation? And I talk about Ramakrishna and Vivekananda and what have they said about this topic. And then I get into the science a little more. And I say, well, actually, there is an area where there's some pretty interesting science going on that is, if we want to be modest, we could say it's at least suggestive of the possibility of reincarnation. And that's the work of Jim Tucker, building on the earlier famous work of Ian Stevenson, University of Virginia. And his really famous case is Ryan Monroe. And I remember seeing this on NBC Nightly News a few years ago. And I actually showed this clip in a lot of my classes, where you have this little boy from Oklahoma. His parents are Southern Baptists, so they don't believe in reincarnation. They have no motivation to implant the idea in his mind through suggestion that he was someone else at some point. He just had all these very detailed memories, this really detailed knowledge in his mind of this relatively unknown Hollywood agent named Marty Martin. And when they connected with Tucker, Tucker did what he does. That is, he did the research, and he found just remarkable correlations between what this little boy was saying and the details of the life of this man, details that were not widely available. He wasn't a famous person, and in fact, the really remarkable one is that when Ryan actually correctly gave the age at which Marty Martin died, and the birth certificate had been mistaken about that. And right. They spoke with his children, and it turned out the birth certificate was wrong, and the little boy from Oklahoma knew when this man died. So I was actually on another podcast recently talking about this, and the person I was talking with expressed some skepticism, say, well, reincarnation.
I think the Carbuckle podcast. That's
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
With Shaw.
Yeah, and then they said, well, reincarnation isn't the only explanation for this. I said, well, another one that comes to mind is that there was some telepathic link between
Right.
this little boy and that man. But then, even if we go with that, we've radically undercut the dominant materialist paradigm, because
Absolutely.
this is not a mechanistic causation occurring. And what Tucker does in his book Return to Life is actually use quantum theory and the double slit experiment to construct an idea of consciousness as non-local, as involving causation on levels that we would not normally, attribute to a mechanistic universe, and comes up with a model of reality that's strikingly Vedantic. He describes the passage from one life to another as the transition from one dream state to another dream state.
Right.
And I mean, that's right out of the Vedantic scriptures, or Yogacara Buddhism for that matter. And so, and this is, I think, very interesting, because Tucker is not, to my knowledge, particularly well versed in Indic traditions. But through looking at the data and looking at the current science, he's basically replicated what certain Indic traditions say about the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality, which to me is suggestive that, again, if there is an objective nature of existence, that it's being independently perceived and arrived at through different methods and different sources. So again, it's not that it proves it true, but it means you're not crazy if you think it may be true. And it's in fact, in some ways, a more compelling option than the traditional materialism, because you got to explain Ryan somehow.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Racchit?
Nothing to add over here.
So yeah, I mean, for me, like, so that was, I previously I've read Ian Stevenson's work, 20 suggested cases for reincarnation, which is a fascinating read, and I think, like, if anyone spends time and reads that book, you can see the amount of diligence and time and energy, and he does really steel man the opposing position, and tries to show that this cannot be reincarnation. This cannot be. There could be no other explanation, and he has to take the position that maybe it's something happening, right? And the crazy part to me is, even if one of these cases is true, and I think you mentioned this too, and even Tucker mentions it, and I think Ted Christopher, or
Yes.
yeah, he also mentions it. It's this idea that if any of these things is shown to be even possibly true, why aren't we doing any more work on it, and why aren't we not trying to understand if our own presuppositions about the material world are in fact not correct?
Right.
And
Yeah.
and there's like this ossification, and there's this, I guess, resistance from scientists that if you even jump into that subject, you're a kook, you're a quack, but the thing is, someone did the work already to show that this is a possibility. If it is possible, shouldn't we explore that as if we truly believe we are investigators of truth, trying to understand reality? Shouldn't that be something that we should look at?
Absolutely. And I think it reveals the fact that we're not doing it to a greater extent than we are. It sort of proves Thomas Kuhn's famous thesis that scientific advance has as much to do very often with social factors and people's prejudices and who gets funding and that sort of thing. One of the things that I found encouraging, though, is if you look on University of Virginia's website, they're actually using Tucker's research as a fundraising device. They're saying, look at this interesting research we're doing. So they're not hiding it or trying to cover it up. So maybe there is an opening here. Another thing that I find, too, among scientists, I've consulted our local physics professor here at Elizabethtown College about a lot of this, a physicist named Mark Stuckey. He's very open to all of this. I mean, the physicists, I think, are sometimes several steps ahead of what many of the rest of us are. And in fact, I was talking about some of the weird quantum effects and things that Tucker was talking about, and Mark was saying, "Oh, it's even weirder than that." And he was getting into detail about all of these things. And so, what happens, I think, is that the other sciences, and then you sort of move away. If you think of physics as like the ultimate hard science, and then you move into biology, psychology, and then finally out into, the social sciences, and then the study of religion and so on. We're all later to catch up to where the physicists are, right? So
Right.
I think a lot of the popular materialism is sort of 18th century materialism, really, that not even any real physicists believe in anymore. So it's a matter of getting this knowledge out to a wider public. Because, I mean, I talk to my students about these things. You say quantum theory, you can immediately see their eyes glaze over, right? Unless it's like the one physics major in the room, and then they get excited. But people are so intimidated by science very often, especially people who go into the humanities, into fields like mine. They don't want to have that conversation, and I have a really good friend who's quite a skeptic about all of these things, and very often they are as invested in their skepticism as we believers might be in our belief. That is, a materialist paradigm is something. This is hard for me to conceive of, but I take their word for it, that a lot of people actually find comforting, that they like to think that, well, this life is it, and then when I'm done, I don't have to deal with anything else, and that's all there is. And so they are as threatened by this kind of conversation as, say, a traditional church person would be threatened by it. So
I mean, from my perspective, I mean, honestly speaking, I grew up in this tradition, so I have a sense of reincarnation and rebirth. But I'm also very, to be honest, and this is a problem I think I have for myself, is I have this belief that I want to believe in, and I think it's probably true. But then I have this sense about me trying to be like objective, skeptical, that pulls me away, right? And there's this constant struggle within myself to deal with how to justify the possibility of me even having that belief. Right.
And that's perfectly understandable. Right.
So so your book and all reading all this was very, very helpful to get me to a position where I'm closer to be like, okay, I think my belief system might be more true than, or at least more possible true than I give credit for. So in that sense, this book was great. So from a personal perspective, I really enjoyed it. And your article was well argued, well put together. And I was just going to say, one of the things I have noticed is physicists, like you said, are much more likely, especially quantum physicists, to buy into or to be like, hey, this is a possibility.
Right.
What I find is a lot of neuroscientists have difficulty with it because of their intense focus that the brain itself is a seat of all consciousness, and it's an epiphenomenon as opposed to being like a fundamental nature of reality that quantum physics sees it as.
That's right.
Racchit, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, a few things. I would disagree that most physicists hold that point of view. In the early 20th century, they did. So you had the Schrodingers of the world, the Heisenberg, and all these guys who interacted with even Swami Vivekananda and so on. They had these kind of views. I think it was historian of science. I'm forgetting his name right now. It was at Berkeley, who really talks about epistemological anarchism. And one issue that he brings up is back in the day, physicists were actually sort of poets as well, right? They had a large sort of grounding in other fields of thought as opposed to just physics. And what's happened with hyper-specialization is most physicists today are really experimentalists, right? So they don't really think about the philosophical underpinnings of their worldview. This materialist worldview really comes from the Vienna Circle, logical positivism.
That's right.
That was really influenced by a misreading of Wittgenstein. And most people don't realize Wittgenstein himself was actually, didn't believe in any of this. And if you see some of his unpublished writings that are just coming out, I think Ray Monk did a beautiful job about writing his biography. What's the term that he uses to describe Wittgenstein's own belief system, where I think it's a fideist or something. I think
fideist, right.
Yes. Sorry, there you go. And so it's really brilliant to see that the logical grounding of this worldview is pretty shaky, and that most people who espouse this view haven't actually gone back to study the foundations. But on the flip side, again, Professor Long, as you talked about, most people in the social sciences, even neuroscience, psychology, haven't studied enough of the hard sciences to, let alone getting to the philosophical foundation of the sciences to question those beliefs that are propagated into these, more. I guess I'm losing what word would I use for these higher sciences, or some stuff that's well removed from the basic grounding of reality.
Well, you're right, yeah, and so this sort of materialist worldview is simply taken to be the scientific view,
Right.
By people, people in my field, for example, because we are dependent on the scientists in those fields for our understanding of what's going on, and if we don't stay abreast of that, we're just going to repeat the prejudices of others. And I think what Mukunda, what you said about neuroscientists is also really true, that it's sort of axiomatic that the brain is the generator of consciousness,
right,
rather than what it might be from more of this sort of Vedantic or quantum perspective is something like a receiver of consciousness. And I remember, again, I mentioned my skeptic friend who also is a neuroscientist, and he said, look, if I bash your head in, there is no more consciousness. You are not there. And my retort to him was that, well, if you bash my TV apart, I'm not getting any more signal, but that doesn't mean the people at the TV network aren't still transmitting. It's
right.
just my physical receiver is no longer capable of picking it up. So, yeah. So I think that the evidence underdetermines really either side of this debate. I think we're still at a stage where it's like William James says, we tend to think what we want to think about these things and then match up the evidence with those prejudices. But I think in our dominant discourse, there's an assumption that materialism is a prejudice, that it's somehow an established scientific truth. And it's really not. It's a philosophical perspective along with the others.
You're right. I mean, there's like this trend now, I think, with like people like David Chalmers and the Heart Problem of Consciousness. You have David Eagleman, who's also a neuroscientist, who they're all coming to this perspective, or some of them are, saying that consciousness might be a fundamental reality, but what that means is different, right? That's a very difficult, how do you go from there to say it's a jiva or atma or something else? It's a whole nother step, but at least there's this dialogue now to say that maybe there's something inherent about the nature of consciousness that is not just materialistic.
Exactly.
It's like it's like a small step.
Small step, yeah, small step, and it's a step away from actually a very deeply held, I would call it, Western view, because you have both religious and non-religious versions of it, which is that consciousness is somehow an add-on to what is basically a material reality. And of course, the religious version of this is in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. God creates human beings out of the stuff of the earth and then infuses life into them. And then, of course, the secular version of this is through physical processes, consciousness evolves over time.
Right.
But in both cases, there's just an assumption that the material world is the basic thing. And this is something I always like to sort of flip with my students, and they always say, oh, this is very mind-blowing and so on, but the idea that consciousness is prior and that what we call a material world is the way consciousness appears to itself. So it has to appear as something. It appears as time, space, causation. But how do you know when you're in a dream and when you're in what we call waking life? When you're in the dream is as real as the waking experience.
Right. Racchit?
No, I actually like the point you brought up about Chalmers and just this rise of Panpsychism. And Professor Long, I'm not sure how much you've studied Vaisheshika and Samkhya, but are there any correspondences in the worldview that's espoused by modern Panpsychism and the Vaisheshika or Samkhya view of the world?
I would think it would be closer to Samkhya than to Vaisheshika. Of course, the Vaisheshika have the atomic concept of self, and I think that this emerging panpsychism is probably closer to Samkhya, where consciousness is more of an all-pervading reality. There are, of course, different phases historically of Samkhya. What we think of as the classical Samkhya, there's this total ontological separation of the Purusha, the pure consciousness, from the Prakriti, but it is misidentifying itself with the Prakriti. There are sort of earlier iterations, or maybe you'd call them proto-Samkhya indications in places like the Upanishads, where the Purusha is pervading the Prakriti. And that, I think, is close to certain versions of Panpsychism or as David Ray Griffin in the process school of thought calls it, pan-experientialism. One of the interesting differences, I think this is a difference among panpsychists, is a willingness to call this all-pervasive something, whether to call it consciousness or to call it something else. Because I know Griffin, for example, has reservations about using the word consciousness for anything other than consciousness as we conventionally experience it.
Right.
But he's willing to go as far as with Whitehead as saying that there's even experience at the subatomic level. And then, I mean, there's sort of this differentiation between experience and consciousness. Whereas I think in the Indic traditions, they sort of bite the bullet and they just say that's all consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Consciousness at different degrees of manifestation, but consciousness. And I think another really important thinker in all of this is Sri Aurobindo, who really bridges the gap between Western and Indic thought, I think. And he's one of the few people who's been in this privileged position of being very steeped in both traditions. And when he talks about evolution and involution, for example, you know, these two sides of the same coin. Is consciousness evolving or is it manifesting? Well, it's both, and you know, and it's you know, two sides of the same process. And of course, Vivekananda is the first one to coin this terminology, but he passed away before he could develop it. I think that was left to Aurobindo really to develop that further. But yeah, towards seeing the universe as a manifestation of consciousness, I think that was probably closer to Vedanta than either Samkhya or Vaisheshika. But I think Vaisheshika is interesting because you have the Atman being one of the substances.
Yep.
And so it is in that sense, you know, part of the givenness of the universe. So I'd say that definitely is a correspondence. But this question of, you know, of consciousness being atomic versus all pervasive, I don't know, maybe I'm just giving my own Vedantic bias away, but I tend to think more of in the sort of all pervasive terms. But yeah, I think there's work to be done on the correspondences with Vaisheshika and modern science as well on this topic.
And Vijayadvaita Advaita tries to have it both ways by
Yes.
by saying the Atma is Anu, but it's Vibhu because it spreads out its energy everywhere. It's
Vivekananda has this great way of saying this in very simple English. He says the self is a circle whose circumference is infinite,
yeah.
but whose center is in a specific point. And it's like you said, it's having it both ways. And he says that point is the body, and that what happens in reincarnation is that center moves to another point. But the all-pervading circle, you know, sort of moves with it or stays the same, or, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
the paradoxical idea of an infinite circle. So
it also comes from Katha Upanishad, right, where it says the minutest of the minutest and larger than the largest. So it's a sense of like the Atman is beyond description. Whatever you want to, whichever way you want to talk about it, it's more than that, or whatever.
That's right. And then the Jains do something. They take yet a third route where the Atman pervades the body, and they compare this to a light turning on in a room. So the light coming out of the lamp takes the shape of the room, and in reincarnation, the shape, as it were, of the soul changes to accommodate the shape of the new body, just as if you move the lamp from one room to another. Right. And it is certainly the case that there's an immediacy to our consciousness of our body that is not there elsewhere in the universe. I mean, at this stage in my personal spiritual evolution, I can't know what's going on Jupiter with the same immediacy that I know what's going on in my stomach or in front of my eyes, you know, or these things. So yeah, I think there's still a lot to investigate in regard to these areas.
I mean, I think quite a few of your authors in this, like Larson, and then I think Christopher Key Chappell talk about the idea of like Buddha and remembering his past lives, along with the Mahavira and the Jainas, and then including you know, within Patanjali yoga system, they also talk about the fact that once you get to a pure state of samadhi, your past life information kind of starts shooting into you, or expresses itself.
That's right. Yeah, and that's one of the things I really am grateful to these authors for, is that they included all of these perspectives in this book. So you've got like you said, Lear, when talking about Western manifestations of this idea, all the way back to Plato and Pythagoras, right up to the present day. You have Jerry Larson really kind of bringing Samkhya into dialogue with a literary expression of the idea of rebirth. And then another article we haven't mentioned, but Nick Serra, who's actually an old friend of mine from college, talks about reincarnation in the work of William Butler Yeats, and getting into Western esotericism back in the 19th century and early 20th centuries. And, interesting people like Aleister Crowley and all of those guys.
The Theosophical Society, all that stuff, right there. Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got the ones focused on the Hindu tradition, Ithamar Theodore with the Gita piece, Steve Rosen talking about the wider Vaishnav tradition. And it's really, I'm quite grateful to these authors for having made this a very rich collection. And
absolutely. It's something that, like the one thing I really appreciated about this is these are topics, or the reincarnation is something like, that sits on my mind a lot, right? Like in the sense of how would it work if it did work? What would the mechanisms be? Like in all these. And I remember just recently, 2 weeks ago, at a family gathering, we're talking about like reincarnation and why and how I think it would work. In a sense, and but there's so many variables that play into the idea of reincarnation. I think it becomes incredibly difficult as a conceptual academic field to jump into, just because you have to account for so many different things. I don't know, like how do you think that, how would you be able to approach it in that sense?
Well, I think it's a field that's in its infancy, and what we need is, and this is really a place where the humanists and the scientists can really come together. Because I think we need people like Stevenson and Tucker doing the past life memory research. What are the empirical data that we're seeing in children? What can we say is the case? And of course, it's not lab science, so that makes it more challenging. But we have to account for A. Ryan Monroe, because it's simply not plausible to say that this was coincidence. Too detailed, it's too rich. Him getting the death date correct, that's something that you couldn't produce in a lab, but it's a very compelling piece of information. We need the physicists, and I think we need the physicists and the neuroscientists to talk to each other more, and on these questions about consciousness and how quantum can relate to what's going on in the brain. But at the same time, I think we need the religion scholars and the philosophers to be first of all, the textual scholars to just be digging into all of these very rich traditions that talk about reincarnation in great detail. There's a Vaisheshika model of how rebirth works. There's a Jain model of how rebirth works. There's so many multiple models of how this could be, so many Buddhist models of how it could work. And then you expand that beyond India, Native American concepts, ancient Greek concepts, Taoist concepts, and so forth. So putting together, what exactly do we mean by reincarnation in all of these various traditions, and then at some level having more of a meta conversation. I guess this is really where the philosophers would come in, where we bring the scientific conversation and all of this data from the world's religious traditions into a dialogue. And I don't necessarily think this would ultimately issue in a kind of final theory of this is how it is. Or, Samkhya was right all along, or something like that. But maybe that would be the ideal that would motivate it, right? Just like the idea of a grand unified field is a motivating concept that may never actually manifest, but it can drive a lot of very productive research. So, trying to figure out reincarnation could be this multidisciplinary project that brings together, biology, neuroscience, physics, and Indology, your old-fashioned, Sanskrit textual scholars, looking, pouring through the libraries, all really being part of this common enterprise of trying to figure out the reality behind this, because it really does have an impact on how we perceive ourselves and the choices we make in our day-to-day existence.
Absolutely.
And it matters, I think, in that sense. Just like knowing that we're on a tiny planet in a not particularly interesting galaxy in a corner of a very large universe has an impact on the way we think. Seeing our current life as maybe, one chapter in a very, very long story, or as, you know, one drop in an ocean of being, will also shape our self-perceptions.
Absolutely. Racchit?
Nothing to add. Thanks.